Eh bien, bonsoir et merci d'être présent ce soir pour écouter la conférence de Niels Brugger, que je suis très heureuse d'accueillir comme professeur invité à l'École des Chartes. Donc, Niels, je vais te présenter en quelques mots. Tu es professeur à l'Université d'Aarhus, au département des médias et du journalisme. Et tu es un historien bien connu du web danois, mais un historien du web en général. En 2000, tu as cofondé le Centre d'études Internet de l'Université d'Aarhus. Et tu es aussi responsable d'une infrastructure de recherche pour l'étude du web archivé qui s'appelle NetLab. Tu es aussi cofondateur et rédacteur en chef de la revue internationale Internet Histories, Digital Technology, Culture and Society. Nous, on s'est rencontrés il y a un peu plus de 10 ans, je pense, alors que tu étais en train de mettre en place un réseau de chercheurs européens pour travailler sur les archives du web, un réseau qui s'appelle RESO, et qui existe toujours, qui aura la joie de nous réunir à nouveau un peu plus tard cette année au mois de juin. Je voulais aussi expliquer un peu l'idée qui a amené à cette conférence. Il y a quelques années, tu as posé un concept vraiment important pour les historiens du web et toutes les personnes qui utilisent le web archivé ou les archives de l'Internet, qui est le concept de reborn material. Donc, on connaissait les documents numérisés, les documents nés numériques, mais l'idée c'est que les archives web sont encore d'autres types de documents puisqu'ils sont nés une deuxième fois. D'où l'importance d'avoir une méthode d'analyse de ces sources particulières vraiment adaptée. Et tu as proposé le terme de philologie. Qui forcément, quand on est à l'école des chartes, la philologie, c'est une des matières qu'on travaille dans cette école, probablement d'une manière et sur des objets très différents. Donc ça me tenait vraiment à cœur de pouvoir t'inviter à venir ici, dans cette école, nous parler de l'idée d'une philologie du web archivé. Donc merci beaucoup d'être parmi nous ce soir, et je te passe la parole.
Yes. Et merci Emmanuel. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's really been great. I've been here in Paris now for a couple of days, and as I put it on my first slide here, coming home, because I feel like coming home when I come to Paris, and for various reasons, I'm going to show you 3 years. The first one is 1986. I was studying at the time French language and culture and history of ideas at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. And I was preparing my master's, which was about the work of Jean-François Lyotard. And I went to Paris. I lived here for half a year and followed his courses, as well as those of Deleuze and Derrida and others of the people who were there in the 80s. It was a great time. And next year is 1990. I was at that year preparing my PhD, which was about the concept of the intellectual in French philosophy after World War II. Has nothing at all to do with what I'm doing now. But I was here in Paris again for half a year, and followed some courses at some of the universities, and I had the fortune to have rented an apartment in Rue des Deux Ponts. I don't know if you know where it is. Ile Saint-Louis, center of Paris. Looking out my window, I could see Le Panthéon, could look out, see Notre Dame to the right. It was an amazing time to stay there half a year. I really enjoyed that. The last year I mentioned here is 1992. I got married at the time with my wife, still my wife. And we were married at the municipality in Aarhus. We went on honeymoon to Paris. We stayed in the apartment in Ile Saint-Louis 2 weeks, went to Roland Garros and saw some tennis and lots of good things. And then we got remarried, which you can do, because there is actually a Danish church in Paris. I don't know if you know it. It's aux Champs-Élysées, or one of the streets to the back of Champs-Élysées. Siemens churches. We have them all over the world. And we got married there once again. So I'm actually married in Paris. So that's why I think I feel like coming home in some way. I will, as you can hear, be speaking in English, but as I put it here, vous pouvez poser vos questions en français si vous voulez. Je reprendrai probablement en anglais ou peut-être en franglais, entre les deux. So, okay, back to English, where I feel most comfortable right now at least. So I will start with this slide here, which shows, as you can see, École nationale des chartes. It is from 2002, and it is, as you can see it, in the Internet Archive. Beautiful. You can really see the time has elapsed here. And what can we learn from just looking at that picture there? We can learn at least a few things. First, that the web is growing in importance in our society. Try to imagine, take away the web one day, you really will feel you'll really miss it. So it's really an important thing in our society. Also, as you can see here, this is not the way that l'École des Chartes website looked now. So the web is disappearing, and it is disappearing extremely rapidly. I'm sure the people from the BNF can say a few words about how rapidly, but some figures suggest that it's a couple of months that a web page is online, and then it's either taken off or changed or something else. Of course, for a historian like me, it makes it a little bit difficult to write the history if you don't have your sources, so that's why it's important to have it in some way. So that's where the solution is, of course, web archives. We have to keep the online web in a web archive, in a collection, and that's basically because it's disappearing. So for the next 1 hour and a little bit, 1 hour, 5 minutes-ish, I will take you through these points here. Few words about web history and web archives, and I will introduce to you 4 initial distinctions that are important to have in mind, especially when I speak as here at an institution where the term archive may mean something different than it actually does when you talk about a web archive. Then I will give you a few examples of existing or web histories that have been written, and then comes what will be the major part of the presentation here, the characteristics of the archived web. Probably take 40 of the 1 hour, 40 minutes of the 1 hour. And I will take you through first what has characterized the online web, and then what characterizes the collecting of the online web, the preserving, and the making it available. And I'm going to use this thing up here so that you can actually follow where we are in the process. This one will go through all the slides so you can see where we are. And then I'll spend the last 10 minutes-ish to talk about web philology. Philology is not my home turf. I'm not a philologist. This is more your area, I guess. But still, it could be interesting to discuss what can we understand by web philology and what are sort of the new questions that arises because we have the archived web. If you want to know more, this is a book I published in 2018 called The Archived Web, Doing History in the Digital Age. Most of what I'm going to talk about is something that you can find in that book. Yes, so that's a few words about that. Also, forgot to mention, if some of you would like to talk to me later, within the next couple of days, feel free to email me. We can set up a meeting if you want to, I don't know, have a cup of coffee, whatever. I'll be here Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday next week as well. So feel free. But the 4 initial distinctions, and this is actually going back to what you mentioned, Emmanuel. I distinguish, when I talk about digital stuff, digital material, I distinguish between 3 overall groups or types of digital material based on how it became digital. The first one is what I call digitized, and that's very straightforward, as here illustrated with a newspaper. Newspapers are being digitized, and then you have something from paper becoming digital. That's one type of digital material. There is an original that we can go back and find, the paper version, and then someone has digitized it. The next one is what you probably know as the born digital. here is illustrated by a website. And obviously, there is no other version of the born digital than the born digital. There is no paper version to go back to of the web. We cannot have the web in paper. So this is the born digital. It has never existed in any other form than the digital. And then what I call the reborn is when we take the born digital and then archive it, and in this process makes changes to it. And these changes can be minor, and they can be more, and they can be really, really many changes. But no matter what we do, when we do some web archiving, we will change the born digital material in some way. So that was the first distinction. Now comes the second one, and this is where it's important to mention when I'm speaking here in this setting, that web archives are not archives in the strict sense of the word. They are more like libraries. Because archives is where you put stuff, in general at least, that have not been published. Whereas libraries is where you put stuff that has been published. And the web archives contain stuff that has been published on the online web. So that's why the term web archive is in many ways misleading, because it's not an archive strictly speaking, it's a web collection of published material. That's why I have suggested the term webraries, which will never catch on because it's a weird word, but it's actually, if you should follow the idea from the library, which means Liber with books, and then it should be webraries for web material. Of course, it will never be the term, and we are stuck with web archives because that has been the term for 25 years almost. So, but anyway, it's important to have in mind that a web archive is not, and it's not an archive on the web either. Many people, especially historians, think that a web archive is a collection of historical document that you can find on the web, which is not the case. A web archive contains stuff that has been on the online web and has then been archived. So, as you could see with the first thing I showed with the website of l'École des Chartes. Of course, we have examples, or you have examples. In France, you have 2 national web archives. I can see we only have representatives from one of them, the BNF. But you have another one at INA as well. Another national, they have 2 different mandates. I'm not going to dive into that, but at least you have two different web archives, national web archives in France. And of course, you may also know the transnational, the Internet Archive in California, in the US. I don't know how many are familiar with the Internet Archive in California. I know some of you are, at least. Others are not. Okay, good to know. But the Internet Archive is just a few words about that, since some of you are not familiar with it. The Internet Archive is a guy who is called Brewster Kahle in 1996. He had sold a company called Wise. He's got a lot of money out of that. He didn't know what to do with it, so he thought, okay, maybe I should archive the web. Good idea. So he just did that. He started, and it just sort of kept on going, and he's still doing it. And so the Internet Archive is an open, online, accessible collection of the web, probably the biggest collection of the web, of the archived web that we have. Okay, last or third of the initial distinctions, when we have an archived website like the one here, we can, as a historian, approach it in 2 different ways. We can either make what I call history of the web. We can make it an object of study, like if we wanted to study this website or the websites of, say, French institutions, teaching institutions, or whatever. So we can study the website as such, but we can also use it as a historical source to study something else. For instance, how are French institutions communicating on the web, or are just communicating in general, and then the web would be one source among other sources. So these are 2 different ways of using the same material as an object of study or as a source. And you can, of course, combine them and do both. The fourth distinction, last one I would like to do here or make here in the beginning is when you look at the web, it doesn't tell you how to study it. You can study so many you can do it in so many different ways, and to kind of make a sort of systematic approach to how you can study the web, I distinguish, or in the book I mentioned in the beginning, in five, what I call 5 analytical strata, 5 ways of focusing our study of the web. And I call it the web element. There's coming an illustration in a second. I call it the web element, the web page, the website, the web sphere, and the web as a whole. So it looks like this. It's taken from the book I mentioned initially. So we can study individual small web elements, like maybe we're interested in images or in video, text, graphics, whatever. So we focus on them and only on them. We could also focus on the page, the web page. Maybe we're interested in how the layout is or the design or whatever. We can also focus on the website, which is a collection of web pages. A website like, I don't know, tf1.fr or something like that. That would be a website. We can focus on that as well. And then the gray one here is what I call the web sphere, as it's put here. The web sphere is the web activity related to some sort of either an event, sport event, political election, catastrophe, terrorist attacks, something like that. All the things that are related to that on the web. I term that the web sphere. And then the last object of study is what I call the web as a whole. By that I mean all things that sort of transcends the other objects. Could be web browsers, for instance. Web browsers come with a history. So we could study that. It could be the protocols or something like that. So there's a lot of objects as well that does not fit or that sort of goes through and transcends all the other ones. And this one here is what we study when we study what we actually see. When you open a web page in your web browser, you see a web page. All good. But the web page is shown because beneath it there is HTML code. And we can study that as well. We can study the elements, the page, the website, etc. on the code level as well. And then, of course, we can study both and see how they interrelate, how the code makes something be visible on the visible layer. So these were 4 initial distinctions just to get us started. Hope I didn't kind of scare you away. But now I will give you a few examples of how other people than me have done history of the web or web history. And I'm going to use this way of approaching it to sort of illustrate my example. So the first one is this one here. It's a colleague from Denmark, from another university. She wrote an article or a book chapter about the aesthetics of web advertising, and she studied advertising on the web. And it was just focusing on these small web elements that the ads were. So it could be banner ads, it could be anything else, web advertising. So she focused on one little thing, and then she tried to make her story based on that. This one here is called A Visual Convergence of Print, Television and the Internet, charting 40 years of design change in news presentation. So this is a guy who studied web pages and the design of web pages, how that had changed over a 40-year period, and then compared it to other media as well. We have examples of one here who did history with the web, Sophie Gebet, and it's actually the book who is standing over there, the last one as far as I can see, who wrote this book, La fabrique numérique des mémoires de l'immigration maghrébine sur le web français, her doctoral thesis from Aix-en-Provence. And it was a history with the web. It was actually a history of something else, where she used, among other things, the web as one of the sources. We also have an example here of history of the web. Federico Nanni, who wrote an article about reconstructing a website's lost past, methodological issues concerning the history of unibo.it, which is the University of Bologna's website. So he's made the history of one website, and that's basically it. So that's focusing on one website and its history. This one is an example of a web sphere analysis. It's actually the book that coins the term web sphere. It's about the about the political election in the US and how that was sort of covered on the web. Last one here is by Mark Weber, Browsers and Browser Wars. It's a book chapter, as it put here. It's about the history of web browsers. So it's something that sort of goes through, transcends all the other objects. So just so that you can see, there is different ways of doing web history with the archived web, and we actually have, these are just examples. There are many, many more examples for each of these ways of approaching it. For the time being, I myself doing something that would probably be a web sphere based analysis. I'm making an analysis of the Danish web in the 1990s. So I'm trying to write the history of a national web in the beginning of the 90s. So now to the third point, characteristics of the archived web. So this is going to be the major part of what I'm going to say. Oh, as you can see here, this is sort of the agenda unfolded, and we are now here because you have to know a little bit about the online web, because before we can sort of tell you, or I can tell you something about the archived web. So the online web, what characterizes that? It's actually very few things I'm going to mention here. And as you can see here, I have it in two columns. This one here is with a digitized collection, and I comparing the online web to a digitized collection of newspapers to give you an impression of what characterizes the online web. So I have to have something to sort of contrast it to, and then I'm using digitized newspapers. So here comes a couple of characteristics in a minute that characterizes digitized newspapers, and here come some characteristics that characterize the online web. So when you look at a digitized newspaper, and you should imagine you have actually you can do it yourself. You can take a newspaper, put it in a scanner, and then scan it, and that's basically it. That's basically what happens. It only has one textual layer. You can argue that it maybe have a little bit more than one layer, but at least for the principle, let's just say that it just has one layer, which is the image of the newspaper page. You can add another layer of optical character recognition, so-called OCR, if you want to. But in general, it has only one layer. There is an image, and that's basically it. The web also always comes with two layers. It comes with what you see when your web browser interprets the file that it receives, and then it comes with a second layer, which I call the invisible layer, which is the one that you really do not see. You do not see the HTML file, but it's the file that actually is interpreted in your web browser, and then it makes the web page appear in your web browser. So you can analyze the web in these two layers, what you see, or the version of it that is interpreted in your web browser, and then the code. So this is just to illustrate it, a web page, again from École des Chartes, as it looks when you see it in your web browser. But the second layer here is the HTML code. And that's extremely important to have this distinction in mind that characterizes the online web, because your computer receives this here. It hits your web browser, Safari, Chrome, Firefox, whatever you're using, and then the browser shows this one here. But it actually has this doubleness to it, which the digitized newspaper does not have, at least not in the same way. With a digitized newspaper, there exists a non-digital original in paper. You have there's one copy of the newspaper, and that sort of results in one file. You can chop up in the digitized newspaper in bits and pieces and fragments, but it comes as one image. You scan a newspaper, and then it's one image file, basically. With the web, it is born as fragments, because what you have in the online web, what you see in your web browser as a web page, the one we had just a minute ago, is composed of bits and pieces that is pulled in from different other places. Maybe from the same web server, but it can also be from other web servers. So it's composed of the HTML file, of images and graphics and stuff that is pulled in. So it is actually, the web is born as fragments, which is a huge difference to digitized newspapers, where it's only one file, is one image, is one page in the newspaper, basically. Last point is that the hyperlink is something that you can add. If you have digitized newspapers and you would like to be able to jump from one place to another, then you can add a layer of hyperlinks in the newspaper. But with the web, it's born with hyperlinks. If there are no hyperlinks, you simply don't have the web, basically. It's one of the major inventions that Tim Berners-Lee he sort of makes when he creates the web in the 1991, 92. The hyperlink, the thing that you can jump from one place to another place on another computer, it's still amazing if you start thinking about it. But it's a thing that is inherent to the web. With the digitized newspapers, it's something that you can add afterwards. Okay, so let's then move on, start to collecting. Now we want to collect the online web. We now know a little bit about what characterizes the online web, so what characterizes the collecting of it. I use this definition of web archiving. It's a very broad definition. Any form of deliberate and purposive collecting and preserving of web material. There are many ways of preserving or collecting the web. Screenshots, screen movies, getting it from an API, etc. But I'm going to talk about this here, web crawling, where you put in a URL, a web address, in a web crawler, which is the software that is used for it. Then it goes to the web page that you have on your list, archives that page, pulls out all the links, goes to where those links points, archives that, pulls out the links, goes to those pages, etc., etc. I know this is sort of kind of a little bit simplified, but basically that is what happens with web crawling. And I'm going to, when I talk about web archiving from now on, it's going to be in the web crawling way of seeing it. So again, I'm going to set the digitized collection of newspapers, but now I'm going to contrast it to the archived web, or the collecting of the web. As you mentioned before, we have an original to go back to when we digitize newspapers. We have it in paper. We can go back. If there is an error, we can just do it again. And even if we find out that there was an error and we found out 2 weeks later, we can go back, do it once again, because we had the original. That is not the case with the web. If you don't get it, it's probably gone, or it's probably changed, or something else. So there is no original to go back to, at least not in the same very stable sense that we know it from a paper newspaper that we have and could go back and do it again. So that's why it's important for web archives to do the web archiving right now, because else it is gone. When we do digitizing of newspapers, what is digitized and how it is digitized, it's not very complex. It's more or less putting it in a scanner, pressing a button, off you go, and then next page, next press, etc. I know it's more complicated, but for the principle, and it at least contrasted to web archives, it is very simple. This is some old software for web archiving called httrack. I don't know if some of you may be familiar with it. It was invented in the late 1990s, and it still runs, and it's still out there, and you can still use it. Some new websites it's not very good at, but it's okay. I'm not going to talk about that, but I just want to show it because this is the list of all the things that you have to do as settings. So you have to decide how many links it should, or how many steps it should go away from where you start. If you set it to 1 step, it will only go 1 step away. If it goes 3 steps, you set 3 steps, etc. So the number of steps, you have to define that. You have to define if specific web content should be included or excluded. Should images be included? Should they not be included? Should it stay on the same website? Should it stay on the same web domain, or is it allowed to go elsewhere, etc., etc.? So it's not. I'm not going to go into details with this here. This is just to illustrate that when you want to do web archiving, what you want to preserve and how you want to do it is much, much more complex, and it is less transparent, because as at least the people from the web archives know, once you start it, it just goes loose, and it just grabs more or less whatever it encounters. Wherever there is a link pointing to, it might go and get that. So that's why you may have an idea of what you want to have, and you probably also get what you want to have, but you probably also get a lot that you didn't want to have, because it just is based on following these links. It's one of the reasons why the article I mentioned, or the book chapter about the Bologna University's website, Federico, who made that article, he comes from Italy. Italy is one of the countries in Europe that does not still have a web archive. So he couldn't study the Bologna University's web archive, or the website's history, because there were no web archive in Italy. So what did he do? He traveled. So he came to Aarhus in Denmark, went to the National Danish Web Archive. They had lots of copies of Bologna University's website, which they were not supposed to in any way. And he went to the UK. They had lots of copies as well, and they're even more restricted about staying within the .uk domain. So this is just a small example that tells you a little bit about web archiving is much more loose in many ways, and complex and intransparent. So what you digitize with newspapers is what you see on the page. What is archived in the web archive is the HTML files, the ones with the code, and all the stuff, all the bits and pieces that it links to, images, graphics, whatever, feeds, everything, which is a big difference as well. So the web page that you see as this one here, this is what you see in your web browser, but what goes into the web archive is the HTML file, an image, 2 pieces of graphics, another image, etc. So this is what goes into the web archive, and not what we actually see in the browser. And that's what causes a lot of problems, because once we're going to put it together again so that we want to see it, then we have to find, or the web archives have to find a way of knitting all this together again to kind of be like this up here. So the digitized newspaper is a quite robust way of digitizing, and it can be remade, as I mentioned. If something goes wrong, it's too light, it's too dark, it's too whatever, then you can just redo it because you have the original. Things go wrong during the archiving, and I guess most of the people from the archives in the audience knows that things goes wrong. Maybe not as much as it did in the early years, but still, you really, in some ways, do not know what happens when you let your web crawlers loose. They may encounter a lot of problems. Maybe you have set some settings that it must only archive up till a certain limit in terms of megabyte, and once it reaches that limit and it hasn't finished, then what happens? So there's a lot of things that are much, much more complicated or less transparent than with the digitizing. Digitizing in newspapers, you have a stable original to start with. Your paper version does not change. It's not changing while you digitize it, while you scan it. But that's not the case with the web. That's what I call the dynamics of updating. Because what can happen, and that's especially if it's a big website, is that the website may be updated while you do your web archiving. So if it's a big website, it's not unusual that something that you see on the front page, you see something there, and then your web crawler go through the entire structure of the website, and then the front page may have changed within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, the time it takes to go through the website. So when you put together your website in your web archive, you may have something that has probably never existed on the online web in that form. Because you may have a front page that is from one point in time, you may have another page that is from a different point in time, a third one, etc., and the front page may have changed during the process. So you should imagine something like if you wanted to record a television show, you put in the good old days, a tape, and then you press record, and then when you are halfway through, the beginning was a different one. That is basically what you should imagine if you want to find out what characterizes the web, the archived web, as a type of document. It is simply inconsistent in terms of time, or potentially at least. Last point about the collecting things. You have the digitized collection, and we don't think about that, but it's actually quite important when we start thinking about web archiving. What I call the temporal and the spatial subdivisions of the newspaper are usually made before it is digitized, and it's made by the producer. What do I mean by that? I simply just mean that newspapers come maybe once a day. It's something that the producer of the newspaper has decided. It's not the archiving institution. They just get the copy every day. Here you go, and that's it. They don't decide how to chop up the newspaper in time, for instance, one per day. But with the archived web, the spatial or temporal divisions are made in the archiving process by the archiving actor. So it's the National Archives, if it's the National Archives who does the archiving, they are deciding that we take this website once a day. But they could decide to take it five times per day, or one every second day, or whatever. So all the temporal divisions are made by the archiving institutions, which is contrast to what happens with the digitized newspapers. And of course that has an impact on what goes in the archive. And of course the same also goes for space, because the producer of the newspaper has decided that it starts on page number 1, it ends on page number 32, and that's the newspaper. But a website is more like a continuum, where the borderlines can be more sort of fluctuant, and it can somehow, in many cases, be different to make a strict delimitation of a website. The newspaper is a straightforward thing in comparison. You have only one copy of each. With the newspaper, you may have some of the material archived more than once, which is really, really frustrating in many ways. Again, if we start from the top of a website, you start on the front page, it goes through the structure, and then there is a link to the front page. So if it just follows links, and if it hasn't been told that it shouldn't, then it will archive that front page once again. There may be a link to the same front page from another website. It may be archived once again. So you may have a lot of web pages that are there hundreds of times, thousands of times, because of the links pointing to them, which is a big challenge in many ways. I'll return to that. So now to the second point here, the preserving of what we have then archived in terms of web archiving. What goes in the archive is the HTML files. As I mentioned, it's only this, what I call the invisible part. That's the things that we do not see when we look at it in a browser. That's what is in the archive. And then the fragments, images and stuff as well. So I consider a web archive, as I call it, a bucket full, a huge, huge bucket full of interconnected files that has to be knit together to sort of reconstruct the website that were initially online. So we have the online web, it's collected, and then you have this huge bucket of files, HTML and a lot of other files. I don't know if any of you have, maybe those from the web archives do, but have any idea how many different file types exists in the world? You mean, you know, .text, .ppt, whatever. How many? Maybe the web archives. You shouldn't say it if you know. Anyone knows? Definitely hundreds, yes. More, many, many more. Yeah, anyone? Good guess? I know because I had a project together with the Danish National Web Archive, Netarkivet, where we studied the Danish web. And I just asked them, okay, couldn't you calculate just how many different file types do you have? And they did. 26,000 different file types. Anyone can set up his own or her own file type. I mean, you can just do that. But it just gives you an impression of the complexity of a web archive compared to a digitized newspaper collection where there is only one file type, JPEG or whatever it is, or TIFF, anyway, anything. Maybe two different types. But in a web archive, it's thousands, and it has to sort of to be put together again to make sense to us. Again, I'm comparing the two. The digitized newspapers are usually systematic, it's ordered, it's homogeneous, it's all JPEG files or TIFF or whatever file type it is. The newspapers are 99% homogeneous. It's the same newspaper that comes every day, etc., etc. It's very unsystematic, it's very messy, it's very heterogeneous in the web archive. Messy in many, many ways. In many ways, you do not know what is in the archive. I have discussed that a lot of times with the Danish web archive. What do you have? Well, have a look. Go and look yourself. We don't know. We just went off and took something and hoped the best. And so it's much, much more messy than you can expect. That you would expect, at least when you compare it to newspapers. And it's unsystematic in the sense that the minute you let it loose, it follows the links. And wherever those links takes the web crawler, that's what you archive. Of course, you can set some limitations, etc., but in general, that's the case. You have one newspaper digitized of each page. The problem here with the web archive is that you have, on the one hand, too little, and on the other hand, you have too much. You have too little in the sense that something very often goes wrong, especially if you go to the Internet Archive from the old days. A lot of things are missing. Also, it's not archived every day, so a lot of days are missing. So you're missing a lot. So there's too little, but also there's too much in the sense that, as I mentioned before, the same web entity, the same page, may have been archived more than once. So you may have some pages thousands of times, other pages only once, others again only 10 times, etc., etc. So it is very unhomogeneous compared to the newspapers, at least. Spatial consistency, clear borders with the newspaper. It's, you know where it starts, you know where it ends. It has a page number, so you actually know where it starts and ends. This one is more like what I call a borderland. It's spatial inconsistent in many ways, because you really, in many ways, it can be hard to draw a strict line saying that this is part of a website and this is not. The domain name helps, but it's not, you cannot use that only. Temporal consistency, as I mentioned previously, newspapers, well, it's from this and that date, and that's how it is. But the temporal inconsistency, because of this dynamics of updating, and because of archiving takes time, then it may be temporal inconsistent. So although you think it's from the same date, it may sort of be not quite from the same date. You have in the digitized collection of newspapers what I would call a copy, but when you digitize one page, it's a copy of that page. It's of course not exactly the same because it's not a paper, but it's close to. With the archived web, we have what I call unique versions. Because what was online at the time is not exactly what we get in the collection. Because we may have missed the images, we didn't follow all the links, we didn't do this, we didn't do that, something went wrong. So all the things that we get in the web archive is not a copy on a one-to-one scale. It's more like what I call a version. And that's when it becomes important to have that in mind when I come to the last point about the web philology, because what philology is about versions, evaluating versions. So you will have versions, and they are not versions, as I'll return to, they're not versions of an original in many ways. They're actually just unique versions where the original is definitely gone. And none of the versions can be said to be the original. So we're actually dealing with something where we have versions and only versions and no original, or no version. None of these versions is the original, or can be said to be the original. Moving on to last point here, the making available. And again, contrasting it to the digitized collection. When you look at a digitized newspaper, imagine you have seen that, you've definitely seen that a lot of times. Newspaper, you look at it, there is what I here call no temporality in the page when it is replayed. It doesn't make much sense, but I'll explain it in a second. So when you look at a newspaper, there is no time in that page. It's just now. You see the page, and there is what there is, and everything on that page is from the point now. It's very different with the web, in the web archive. Because there is what I call, especially with the bigger web archives, there is what I call an embedded temporality of the replayed page, and also when you click on the website. I'm going to illustrate this and explain it more in detail. But now you just have it now. So no temporality when you see a digitized newspaper, but what I call embedded temporality when you see the page and when you move around between pages. So the first point, the embedded temporality on the page. Here we have this page, the old one I mentioned in the beginning. It's taken from the Internet Archive, I forgot to say that. It's from the Internet Archive, and they have this new feature that is really, really smart. Because if you press up here in this corner, it reads about this capture. So when you press that, this one rolls out, and it is a list of all the fragments, all the bits and pieces that this page is composed of. And the time that is different from the time when the entire HTML page or the web page as such was archived. So you can see here that there is a button here, button publication, JPEG. It is actually archived 1 year and 2 months later than the page. And this one here is 1 year later, etc. And if you scroll down, there are probably more. And we haven't seen that in any other media. We look at this page, we think, okay, it's a page. It's all from the same date, the 23rd of January 2002. But some of these bits and pieces are more than a year later. If I had found another example, we could have had some that were a year earlier, or a week, or something earlier or later. So this is a weird document, especially if we don't know that this is the case. So that's why I talk about a replayed web page, archived web page, as something that has an embedded temporality, because it has actually time in it. Remember the digitized newspaper, it's in the now, it's the same page all over the page in a way. Here is actually different times in one page that looks like as if it is from the same time. That's weird, but that's how it is. Then if we move around in the web page, this becomes somehow even worse, or it becomes at least different. So I start here, 23rd of January 2002. I click once on this one here, and then I jump a month ahead, 20th of February. Then I click on the second one in the menu. I jump back in time, almost 1 year, half a year back in time to October the year before. And then I click on this one here, the same as actually this one up here, but now I click on the same one in an earlier version, and then I get to August 2021. So I hope you can see what's happening here. It's a mess. And it's really something that you have to know. The reason why it is so is somehow good enough, because what the Internet Archive, the idea behind why they do this is the following. Okay, you want to see this page, you want to click here. Unfortunately, we didn't get it from that day where you wanted it, but we have it from this day. Would you like that? Okay, that's what you get. So that's basically how it works. If they haven't got all the stuff from the date where you start, they just give you what they have from the nearest date. So that's how it works. So imagine here 2 or 3 clicks, I'm way ahead or way back or whatever. I'm at least out of time in many ways. And then if you add the embedded temporality on each of the pages to that, it's really a mess. So I hope you can see the difference to the digitized newspapers. That's easy, and that's kind of systematic, homogeneous, etc., etc. While this is much, much more complicated. And that's, of course, more complicated also when you want to study it. In some cases, it doesn't matter that much. For instance, if we go back to this temporality here, as you can see, the ones that are from different times are a button, publications, the JPEG, other GIFs and something. It depends on what is my research question here. If my research question is, I just want to see some of the text that is on these pages, it really doesn't matter if this button was from 1 year later. But if my project is, if it wasn't the buttons that were from a later time, if it was images and this was a newspaper website, it would definitely make a difference if it wasn't sort of aligned in terms of time. So it depends on, if this is a problem, it depends on what is your research project. And again, the same of course goes from this one here. In many cases, it doesn't make that big of a difference if you jump all around in time. But in other cases, it's really something that makes it impossible for you to use it in basically. So continuing with the making it available, it's relatively with this digitized newspapers, it's relatively stable as a collection, whereas the web archive actually has to follow the developments of the web and develop based on the developments, technical developments and content developments and all other kinds of developments of the web, which is different to the digitized newspapers because they doesn't change, at least not in the same pace as the web does. It's easy to document what you do with the digitized newspapers, and it is quite difficult to document, especially in detail, what happens in a web archive, especially what is collected. Again, I've asked the National Danish Web Archive several times about things if they could document, and they're just looking at me, becoming very tired. And say, couldn't you just stop asking about that? But some web archives have a lot of documentation. I know the BNF are, I would say, among the best to document. Limited number of ways of making it available with the newspapers. There are not many ways of making the newspapers available. I mean, you can search them if you have added an optical character recognition layer, and you can show them. That's basically what you can do. With the web, there is a large number of ways of making the web in a web archive available. So I'm going to illustrate just a few of them. We have our online web, we collect it, we have this bucket of files, which is the web archive. So how do we want to present it to the user, a researcher, a student, whoever? Well, we could try, or they could try to try to remake the website as it looked once it was online. That's what they do in the Internet Archive. They try to re-establish the online web with the differences, all the embedded temporalities and the jumping in time and all that. But still, you may have a researcher who is very keen on looking at what did it actually look like way back. Okay, that researcher gets this. But you may have another researcher coming in and say, oh, I don't care about what it looked like. I'm very much interested in hyperlinks. I want to do network analysis. I want to do network analysis of the most in-linked websites on the French web. So just give me all the links and I'm happy. I don't care about what it looked like. Just give me the links. So that's another way of grabbing stuff out of this bucket of files. Just pulling links out. You may have another researcher coming in, oh, I just want named entities and names of persons and places and stuff. That's what I want to study. Just give me the names, don't care about links, don't care about what it looked like, just give me names. Or another one coming in, I just want to have words, just give me all the words. I want to do word clouds, which were the most used words on the French web in 2010 or whatever. So just give me all the words, don't care about the rest. You may have someone coming in and say, I want to study images. Just give me all the images and then I'm good. And then you could just kind of continue the list. And of course they can be combined. You could say, give me the list. I want to do link analysis. I identify some very central websites. Then go and give me the text of those websites, or just give me the images of those websites and then show me how they looked. So you can have these sort of workflows. And I know, of course, for the people who come from the web archive, they get a little bit tired when they kind of meet all these researchers with all these claims and the things they want to do. because there's so many things you can do in principle. But if the web archive doesn't make it available for you in that form, then of course it's more challenging. But that would be sort of a list of some of the ways that it could be interesting for a web archive to make their collections available. And they're not that complicated still. So, last main point about the web philology, and then I'll let you loose. A philology of the archived web is what I think we need. I hope you can see the challenges are sort of related to the archived web as a document. So we need someone that can actually understand that and deal with it in a way. And that would, in a way, be philology. So we need a sort of what I call a web philological toolbox. And the main aim of it is that we can make as informed choices as possible. We basically should be able to know what are we studying. For instance, the thing about the embedded temporality and all that is extremely important to know. The Internet Archive doesn't make much out of telling it, but it's extremely important to know, depending on what you want to study. So the question I'm going to deal with in the next 7 slides, I think I have 7 left, is how can we consistently say something about the probability of what a given website looked like at a given time in the past on the online web. And the thing I imagine is that, okay, we want to establish what the website of l'École nationale des chartes looked in 2010 on a specific date. What did it look like? 20 so much. We have copies from, imagine we have copies from around the time of the 20th of March. We have from the BNF, from the Internet Archive. We may have from the Danish Web Archive. We may have from other web archives from the same website, almost the same date, or maybe even the same date, but they look different. So how do we deal with that? Because it's a classical philological problem. We have different sort of copies or versions or variants or whatever we should call it of the same, which is not exactly the same. So that's what I'm going to grapple a little bit with in the last slides, this problem here. It's based on an article I made in 2008 called The Archived Website and Website Philology, a new type of historical document. There are coming some illustrations, and they come from this article here, so that you know. So I'm going to give a brief outline, and it's only going to be an outline, some very broad kind of sweeps of the brush, of how we can demarcate between classical textual philology and what I call a website philology. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm by no means a philologist myself. I'm not trained like that. But I understand what the problem is with the web. And I think there are some overlaps at least. So I'll be looking at these 5 points here. The process of creating copies, the relation to time when you do a web philology, what is it actually we focus the analytical objects on. And then I'll end with trying to set up some rules, how you can do this. 6, what I call indicators to help evaluate versions of archived web from the past. So this is going to be the last slides. So the process of making these archived copies is something that brings web philology or close to a normal textual philology, where you compare copies. You compare one copy to another copy, which is basically what you do in philology. You have different copies, you compare them to each other, and in this case, and also in many cases of the classical philology, there is no authoritative original at hand. In many cases, you have to establish what you can maybe call an authoritative original, which you, in many cases, and most cases, actually is not able to do. But this is just to mention that, or to highlight that this way of that we are dealing with copies, and it in a way brings the work with archived web close to something like working with handwritten documents on parchment, or on whatever paper could it be as well, but mainly parchment. So that's the first point. So this is what you would usually do in sort of classical philology when we talk to the how this philology relates to time. You would usually start with, let's say, 2 copies. You compare one copy to another copy. You can see, okay, it's these 2 stems from this one here, and then you can compare these 3, and they stem from this one, etc., etc. Of course, I know it's simplified, but still, it's the way that classical philology would consider time. You would go back in time. You would try to find the provenance and the affiliation backwards in time. This version is newer than this one, that is newer than this one, so this one must have been copied from the older one, etc., etc. So you have time as something you go back, you go steps back, try to compare, which is not the case with the archived web, because there's no going back, because we are looking for copies, versions from the 20th of March of this website, and we don't have the original, and they're all from the same date. We are looking at the same date. The copies we have in the different 5 different web archives are from almost the same date. So the comparison we make when we compare in the web archive is actually only copy to copy. We're only comparing copies, and we cannot go back because there's no going back, because they're all from the same time. Imagine it would be as if all the manuscript of Tristan or something like that would be from exactly the same date, which they are not, but it would be like that. And with the web, we are not, as I put it here, the difference and similarities have to be traced in simultaneity instead of tracing provenance backwards in time. It's a different way of conceiving it, because it's all the things that we're comparing in terms of time is from the same time. So we cannot say that this one was copied from this one, etc. And it makes a difference. So what can, next point, what can a web philology study? Well, it can study, of course, the visible layer of old websites. But then you have to in many ways, have to know something about what I call the running environment, web servers. What did web servers look like in the past? The hardware that people used to see or look at the web pages on. Web browsers, software, plugins, especially plugins, little bits and pieces you have in your web browser. You don't notice it, but it makes things run in your browser. And if they're not there, or if it's an old version, etc. So if you want to do web philology studying the visible layer, then you have to know a lot about all sort of the things that was wrapping up all the websites. There was at one time in Europe, actually, someone tried to make an inventory of all the plugins. I don't know if probably some of you know it or remember it, so that you could actually have the plugins that fitted to the browsers in the correct time, so that you could actually do that. All this point here is also a discussion about emulation. Some of you may be familiar with that. If you don't have the computer from way back, you don't have the browser from way back, you can emulate it. If you are not familiar with it, there is a website called oldweb, in one word, .today, oldweb.today, and they have made web browsers from the very first browsers, and they get their what they show, they get that from the Internet Archive. So if you go to oldweb.today, you can put in a web address, and then you can choose a browser, say a Netscape version 1.5 from 1995, and then it will show the website as it looked in that browser. Anyway, that would be one way of focusing your study. You can also study on the invisible layer of the websites, the HTML code, which is a different. It's not like studying the materiality of, say, papyrus, parchment, clay, or whatever it would be with the older writing media. So the invisible layer, the HTML, is writing, and you can study that as well, which is my next slide here, because that's the good news. Because the HTML code is a treasure trove in itself, because there's so much information, and it's very good to remind oneself what HTML actually means, especially the two last letters, ML. It's a markup language, hypertext markup language. So in the HTML document, we have things already marked up for us, which is a huge advantage. Maybe it's not marked up as as good as we would have liked it to, but still, you can search for the tags, there's different brackets, and if you can search for them, you can search different things, and you get a document that is already marked up to some degree, which is a great advantage if you want to do web philology. Because then you can actually do automatic comparison. Again, we have our 4 different versions of the web page from 20th of March. We could just set a computer to just compare the 4 files that were sort of the front page. And then we can easily see if there are any differences. So the HTML is actually good because it's digital, and it's you can work on it and work with it, and it comes as markup. So it can also, and in the HTML, it can partly help us to identify things that are missing. For instance, we have the URL, the web address, the path, very often, so we can actually see where the file that we're missing should have been. And we may be able to find it in one of the other collections that we had. Or we can maybe see something in the name of a file that is missing. If it's a photo, it may actually have the name of the person in the photo in the file name. So all these things that we have under the hood of what we see is actually something that we can use in many ways. And again, you can extract anything between the tags, so you can identify things in an HTML file in a much more nice and neat way than you can in handwritten things. So now last point, the 6 indicators to help us evaluate versions of archived web from the past. First point here, if we have more versions, have a look at them and choose what I call the least deficient, the one that is the least worst, the best one, you could also say, and use that as the original. So the one that you compare all the other ones to. So again, if we imagine we have 4 different web archives, we have 4 versions or 4 copies of 20th of March, we look at them and see, okay, this one is missing the images, this one doesn't have this heading or whatever, but this one looks quite good. So we start with that, and then we compare the other ones to the one that is least faulty or least deficient. So use that as a sort of a baseline. Second point would be to prioritize proximity in time and space if we have different versions of the same page. And I have put it up here as a rule. The closer the compared versions are to each other in terms of time, if it's from the same version, if it's from the same day, or from earlier or later day, and in space, from the same version, the same archive, or from another archive, the greater the possibility of rendering probable what a given textual element actually looked like on the live web. So this reads like, if you have a copy that is from the same day, in the same web archive, it's probably better than if you have one 2 days later from another web archive. So this is a way of sort of setting this up in a kind of a rule, where you can say, okay, this one is the best one because it's closer in time and space to the one we actually start to compare with. So that would be my second take on it. Then we could explore the speed of change of textual elements, speed with regard to both position and content. And the rule would here go, the more stable an element is, the greater the increase in the possibility of rendering a probable picture of what it actually looked like on the live web. Meaning that if we in 3 versions see that this picture has not changed, it's stable over time, then it's probably okay, and this is probably what it looked like in the past. So we can simply see if all the elements are changing between the versions, if the speed of change is high. Fourth thing is to explore the type of the textual element. I don't know if you're familiar with paratext, the term paratext. You know that? You should. It was invented by Gérard Chenet in his great book, Seuil. Anyway, you can use paratext as something that can help you also when you evaluate different versions, because I distinguish here between what I call global paratext, regional paratext, and local paratext. A global paratext could be a website menu items. It could be a logo, it could be a footer, a header, something like that. It would probably be on a website globally. The regional one could be could be in, say, a section of a website. If you have tf1.fr/sport, that would be a subsection. And you can see if there are some paratext on that subsection. And then you can have what I call the local paratext, could be like a heading on a page. So the closer you get to the global paratext, the more likely they are to be the same. That would be the rule. As we move from the global paratext of the website via the regional and local paratext to the text itself, we also move from stable to presumably high-frequency changing textual elements, thus decreasing the possibility of rendering probable pictures of what the element actually looked like on the web. So if you have a global paratext like a logo, it's probably, or if you have that on all your versions, it's probably the way it looked in the past. But the closer you get to the text itself, as Janetti puts it, the more likely it is to change. And then the more difficult it can be to decide what it looked like on that day. Two more points. You could include knowledge about genre characteristics. What type of a website, what genre is your website? If it is a company website versus a news website, the news website is probably more likely to change more quickly than a company website or something else that is changing less rapidly. So the rule here would go like this. A given textual element is less likely to have been changed if it's found on a website or sub-website that is supposedly relatively stable in terms of genre, because there are differences. So the genre could be something that could help us as well. Last point here is to include some knowledge about website characteristics that are typical for the period. We tend to forget how different the web looked or has looked throughout the last 25 years. If you go back to the 90s, the beginning of the 1996, 97, a menu items were not placed the way that we do it today. They were splash screens. They were just thrown all over the place, like graphics, small GIFs, small graphics, and you could then click one of them. It looked totally different. You would not be able to navigate the web of the 90s, basically, because we're used to other ways of having a menu, because later the menus became vertical, so we had them usually in the left side. And then websites started to grow, and then you had the menu points with sub-menu points and sub-menu points, and then it just exploded, and then it just wiped it all out, and then the menus went up in the top and became horizontal. And then it was a sort of a rolling down menu from the top. So you can use this information as well as something that can help you. Where are we in terms of time in the ways that the web looked in different periods of time? Final slide. If you compare all this and put it all together, you can then sort of try to find a balanced way of evaluating what a website may have looked like in the past. So an overall evaluation of what a website probably looked like in the past, based on comparing the archived version, then you can start combining these indicators that I have talked about. The proximity between versions, the stable textual elements, the stable type of text, stable subsize genre, and the stable type was paratext, and then the knowledge of the period. And this is then if there's a distance between the versions, if the high frequency changes, etc., etc. So the more you are over in this area here, the more likely it is that the versions you have were kind of, you can define or decide which one or what it looked like way back in the past. And the more you go over in this year, the less probable it is that you can actually decide what it looked like when you compare versions. That was the final word. Thank you.
Pour les questions, si vous voulez bien juste prendre le micro pour qu'on les ait dans l'enregistrement.
And you can ask your questions in French if you want. Je comprends, mais je ne reprendrai pas en français.
Thank you so much. Do you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much. It was fantastic, inspiring. I loved it. I have a question about the final step, so philological evaluation. Whether you envisage it as heuristic process, or do you see space for digital philology, and if yes, where we digital philologists can contribute and how?
Could you say a few words more about digital philology? What kind
I'm
of?
just thinking the steps that you are describing. Do you envisage them as analog steps that a scholar just takes those screen grabs and HTMLs and looks at them and evaluates them as philologists would with manuscript pages, or would you envisage some metrics or some features that you could do computationally?
Yeah, I think I go back to this one here, because that's in a way what I had in mind here, that you could do it sort of the traditional philological way. You could have them on a screen, maybe have them next to each other, or you could print them out, and then you could look at them. That would be the first one. But you could also do it semi-computationally or fully computationally if you started comparing files and setting up different tools to do that, and then sort of finding different ways of highlighting the differences. I remember many years ago, there were actually some software online where you could do that. You could upload files, different files, and then it's the same thing you have in Word, where you can actually compare versions and have the differences shown. So that would definitely be a way of doing it in a more digital way. And of course, we should do that, because we should use the digitality of the web and of the tools that we have. Yeah, so I would definitely go that way. Yeah.
Merci. Je vais poser mes questions en français.
Vas-y.
Mais j'ai deux questions qui concernent les web strata. Je me demande à quel point ce modèle analytique fonctionne sur des données empiriques, puisque
sur des données
empiriques.
Oui, d'accord.
How does it work on empirical data? Parce que vous avez dit que la notion de frontière, par exemple de frontière d'un site, était très compliquée à définir. Donc, du coup, comment est-ce que on passe du site à la websphère? Ça, ce serait la première question. Et je m'étonne qu'il n'y ait pas de notion de temporalité dans les web strata. Or, une websphère peut évoluer dans le temps. Par exemple, je peux étudier un groupe de blogs qui a existé dans les années 2010, et ensuite, ces blogs vont sur les réseaux sociaux. Est-ce que c'est la même websphère? Est-ce que c'est autre chose? Comment ça se passe avec de la temporalité?
Super good questions. To the first one about the sort of the delimitations between the different elements. I consider the model, or whatever we should call it, as an analytical instrument that we can actually have the discussions about where are the boundaries between page and sphere or page and element, because we have the model. So I would like to use it as something that can help us discuss these things in a structured way, instead of just saying, I don't know exactly what's happening here. So it's a way. I see it as you could say, analytical strategic tool to have these discussions and to frame them in a way. Yeah, does that make sense? And then the other one about temporality. There is no temporality in the model as such, but the way I use it myself is that I put these web strata next to each other. So if you imagine you had one here, and then we had another one here. Yeah. So I have done some studies where I do that, and then the what you could call, if you have a web sphere, you mentioned the blogs, for instance. If blogs then came on social media, then that would be the web sphere of maybe sociality or whatever we should call it. That at some point in time in 2010, the concrete objects where that web sphere was taking place was on blogs, and later on it was in social media. So it would just be the empirical sort of things that change, but the model is the way that you can grasp it and understand where are we, sort of. I think that would, yeah, that's usually how I use it myself. Yeah, okay.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation. Je me demandais, vous parlez tout du long de la présentation de la conservation via le code HTML, mais les sites sont de plus en plus dynamiques en fait, et avec l'utilisation de JavaScript, des bouts de code qui se baladent à droite, à gauche, mais qui ne sont pas accessibles par exemple quand ils sont cherchés sur les serveurs de grandes compagnies. Comment du coup on peut réussir à archiver le web maintenant alors qu'on n'a même plus accès au code? Est-ce qu'il y a des nouveaux paradigmes qui se sont développés dans la conservation et l'analyse à cause de ce passage du statique au dynamique?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I have to throw it back to the staff from the BNF. How would they do it? No, but it is a problem, and it has been for a long time, way back in, when was it? Late 90s. What was the software that was used for interactive? What is it named? Flash. Exactly. Flash was all over the place. I mean, it was Flash everything, and I think that was also a challenge to archive, or maybe it was a challenge to replay it afterwards. At least it was sort of the same thing, and sort of the keeping or the collecting of the dynamic elements have always been a challenge for web archives, and it's kind of a subject of a bigger question, namely, what is the version that is archived? Because we all know that it's also personalized, what we see, at least to some degree. So what does the crawler look like to the website? Who does it look like? Does it look like you, or does it look like you, or whatever? Because of your crawler things, what you have been doing before, etc., etc. And then comes all the dynamic stuff on top of that. So what is archived in web archives has always been one version among others, and never the real one, because they're different. Because of many things, because of the browsing history we have, because of the dynamic stuff. Some do this, some do that, etc. And then of course I know JavaScripts, they're still a problem, or and especially to show them after. I mean, you can't in a way. So it's a big problem. Yeah.
Si je peux compléter ce que tu as dit, Niels.
Yeah.
Donc oui, c'est un défi parce que c'est une course technologique en fait que de développer aujourd'hui des techniques de collecte qui sont adaptées au web qui évolue en permanence. Pendant des années, on a essayé de développer des robots qui allaient analyser le code des pages et qui allaient extraire les liens. Les liens en HTML, c'était simple. Les liens en JavaScript, c'était simple au début, puis c'est devenu de plus en plus compliqué. Et aujourd'hui, que les pages se composent essentiellement avec des librairies JavaScript, en fait, on est en train de se tourner vers des browsers, tout simplement. Donc on intègre en fait dans les technologies de collecte des browsers sans tête,
type Chromium par exemple, pour pouvoir en fait utiliser des... Voilà, ce qui fait la force de nos navigateurs dans les dispositifs de collecte, pour pouvoir charger tous les éléments et les archiver dans les processus de crawl. Et on développe aussi des techniques qui font que ces browsers, on construit des scénarios d'exécution au-dessus de ces browsers pour pouvoir faire comme si des internautes étaient en train de travailler sur une page, de charger des contenus, typiquement sur des réseaux sociaux quand on a 10 posts Instagram chargés, de pouvoir en charger plus que 10. Voilà, mais on n'en est pas tous au même point sur l'intégration de ces techniques-là. C'est quand même un sacré défi de les faire fonctionner aujourd'hui, en particulier à grande échelle en fait. Ça reste des process aujourd'hui qui sont assez à façon manuelle, avec des opérateurs qui travaillent derrière, alors qu'on a besoin de travailler aussi à une échelle qui est parfois celle de milliers, voire millions de sites.
And then when you scale up, it becomes some sort of middle of the road thing that you get. You not get all of it. But that again has been the case since the beginning of web archiving. And I usually compare it to if we were studying Greek antique culture. We would be happy if we had not the entire vase, but maybe just a fragment or two. We would be really happy about that. And it's the same with the web archives. We're happy that there's something, because the opposite would be even worse. So something is better than nothing, and maybe it's not what we would have liked to, but still. Yeah, exactly.
Oui. Et peut-être pour compléter, parce qu'il y a peut-être des objets comme ça qu'on n'arrive pas à collecter, mais c'est vrai qu'en extrayant les liens, on arrive aussi à vouloir collecter des pages qui en fait n'existent pas, qui sont un peu imaginées par le robot. Et parfois on peut avoir aussi énormément de pages qui sont vides, qui n'ont jamais été vues, qui n'ont pas de consistance réelle par rapport à ce qu'était le site web. Donc si on vous donne les données de nos collectes 2024 du domaine français, en fait, il y aura énormément de biais. D'une part, on pense tout de suite à ce qu'on n'a pas pu crawler, mais en fait, il y a aussi énormément de choses qu'on a crawlées qui sont dans les statistiques, mais qui n'ont pas de sens, en fait, qui sont des biais. Donc, that's a mess. Yeah, you said it.
More questions?
I do have one.
Fire away.
Yes. So when I was when we hear what you say about this philological analysis to imagine or try to determine the probability of something having existed on the web, I have a feeling of vertige because. Yeah, you have the web archives are so big, and it seems like even if you had one page, it would take, I don't know, a very big effort to do really thoroughly this analysis. So I have a very practical question. If we are working with web archives, or if we have students who are working with web archives, when should we advise, and what specific case should we advise that they go through this approach to make sure that what they are doing is right? Is it something that we need to do we have a corpus and we do it at least for a few websites to kind of provide an authentication or an assessment? Or is it a specific use case, and maybe for other kind of studies we won't need that approach, and we would just use whatever is out there?
Yeah, it's a very good question as well, and I think I'll return to what I said earlier about the research question, because in some cases it really doesn't matter. I mean, you just have a website. If it's one or the other, well, who cares? And it doesn't matter for your research question. But if it really does matter, then we have to have some tools that are structured and ways of sort of approaching it so that we can actually describe what we have been doing in these comparisons. So in some cases it might be really crucial that we can do it, and in other cases it really doesn't matter much. Again, if for instance what can we take, terrorist attacks in Paris, Nice, whatever. It could be really important that you know exactly what it looked like on that specific day, and maybe on that specific time of the day. So that's probably a case where it's really important to know exactly what it looked like and what has changed, etc., etc. And you can come up with other cases where it really doesn't matter that much. Yeah, but as for students, I think I would. I mean, those tools that I'm talking about are not out there, ready to use. So we have to maybe go your digital methods way and try to find ways of making these comparisons. And and there are so many different tools out there, and you can probably try them out. But it could be interesting to maybe try to make a small case. I think I would try to do that if I were you here. And it could be interesting to take a couple of websites, find them in different web archives, and just give that to students and see what they can come up with.
More questions? Okay, so thank you again, Niels,
thank you
for your presentation.
Thank you.